Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this webcast of a launch that we are making at the Wilson Center's Global Europe program for David McKean's new book, Watching Darkness Fall. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives at the Wilson Center and Interim Director of the Global Europe program. And I'm so delighted to be able to make a very brief introduction for our distinguished guests here today. Obviously, we have with us David McKean, the author of this wonderful new book. David is a former director of policy planning at the U.S. Department of State, has a very long and distinguished career in foreign affairs, and so delighted to be able to listen to him talk about this work in which he recounts the rise of the Third Reich in Germany and the history leading up to that in Europe, told through the lives of five well-educated and mostly wealthy men, all vying for the attention of the president. To moderate our conversation today, and to moderate in particular the Q&A session, we're also delighted to have with us Mary Jo Binker. Mary Jo is adjunct professor at George Mason University and consulting editor for the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers Project at George Washington University. We're going to have some time for a conversation about the book, and then we're going to open up to questions from the audience. And so please, if you have questions throughout this session, please send them either to our email, which is GEP for Global Europe Program, GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or through Twitter to our Twitter account at Wilson Center GEP. With that, and with my profound thanks to both Mary Jo and David, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mary Jo. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all today and to have an opportunity to talk to David about his very provocative new book. And I wanted to begin by asking today, David, what drew you to this topic?
Well, thanks, Mary Jo. First, I would just want to say thank you to the Wilson Center. Thank you, Duncan and Jason, for having me back. I was here last spring with a former SP colleague, policy planning colleague, Bart Shevchuk, and we talked about a book we'd written called Partners of First Resort about the Western Alliance. So it's a pleasure to be back. So I ended my time in the State Department as ambassador to Luxembourg, which, as many of you know, is a very, very small country. But it happens to be located right in the heart of Europe. It's surrounded by France, by Belgium, by Germany, and at the very northern tip of it by the Netherlands. In fact, I think I took a bicycle ride one time, and 20 minutes later, I took a wrong turn and I was in France. But it is steeped in World War II history. And when I was there, I did by the way, it has the second largest US military cemetery in Europe after Normandy. Over 4,000 American soldiers are buried there, as is General George Patton. So I became very interested in World War II. And, I hadn't really known much about the United States ambassadors at the time. So I got very interested. And when I returned to the United States, I began to read about them. I think the other thing that, frankly, that drew me to this topic is that I'd written a book about 15 years ago on Tommy Corcoran, known as the name of the book was Tommy the Cork, who was a very interesting guy. He was a master political operative. And Roosevelt really never had a chief of staff, but he had sort of these people who operated as policy and political advisors to him. And for a time, Tommy was one of his most important advisors. And so I got to read about Roosevelt and to write about him, and thought, this is really one of the most fascinating presidents in our history. And so that combination of things, I think, led me to the topic.
The period that you chose to write about, the 1930s, it was really very difficult period, not only for America, but for the world. And you note that FDR pretty much prioritized what was going on at home over what was going on in Europe. And I was wondering how you felt that affected his choice of ambassadors and his overall feeling about things in Europe during the
Sure,
1930s.
sure. So a couple of things to sort of keep in mind in terms of Roosevelt. Number one is that he actually had traveled to Europe a lot as a young man, as a child. So he was very familiar with European customs, with their political systems. He served in the Wilson administration as the Assistant Secretary for the Navy. Again, had a lot of contact with his European counterparts. When he became president, as you've said, at really one of the most difficult times in our history. At the peak of the Great Depression, 25% unemployment. The GDP had cratered by a third I think in just 2 or 3 years. There were banks closing every day, people going homeless and hungry. And so, yes, the American economy and the American people were his top priority. But Wilson was an internationalist. And in 1932, when he ran for president, he said very, very little about anything in Europe. But it was always in the back of his mind, clearly. And when he decided to appoint his ambassadors, I think he valued loyalty and trustworthiness above all. And I think what he wanted for his ambassadors to do in Europe were a couple of things. One, many of the European countries owed reparations to the United States as a result of World War I. So he wanted them to he wanted his ambassadors to really sort of operate as a collective collection agency in some ways to get some money back to the United States. He also felt that international trade could benefit the United States during this very dire economic time. And so he appointed Cordell Hull as his Secretary of State. And Hull had absolutely no diplomatic experience, but he was known in the Senate as an expert on trade. And besides, he actually looked the part. He was a very, sort of a wonderful looking man who wore these starched collars and had white hair and stood very erect. And he was a courtly gentleman. And so Roosevelt chose him as Secretary of State. But I think but I think Roosevelt also felt that while he wanted his ambassadors to be very cognizant of the economic situation, he did not want them. And there was, by the way, this was not just a Great Depression in the United States, this was a global depression. Right. And Roosevelt did not want his ambassadors in any way interfering in the internal affairs of any of the countries to which they were posted. So there was very much an isolationist sentiment within the United States. Roosevelt knew that. He was a master politician. He wasn't going to go against it. And so again, he never campaigned, on the issue of foreign policy.
One of the things that was really striking to me when I was reading the book was the fact that the ambassadors obviously felt very free to write directly to the president. And I found myself thinking that's very unusual. Don't most ambassadors, usually the connection is with the State Department and with the secretary, and then the secretary translates those views to the president. Did Roosevelt encourage that with his ambassadors? So
that's a really interesting question, and I might just take a minute to sort of introduce the ambassadors, because there's a sort of an interesting story to each one of them. But you're absolutely right, by the way, that most ambassadors go through official channels, and that means dealing with the Assistant Secretary for Europe, or the Undersecretary, or perhaps even the Secretary. But very rarely the President of the United States. But these were sort of special times, and Roosevelt, by the way, couldn't find a suitable ambassador for Germany when he was first elected. He asked 3 or 4 people, statesmen, to become the ambassador to Germany. He was turned down time and time again. Newton Baker, who was a prominent diplomat and had thoughts of running for president himself, and he turned him down, and others as well. And so at a cabinet meeting, Roosevelt was sort of bemoaning the fact that he couldn't find anybody. And Daniel Roper, Secretary of Commerce, said, well, there's this fellow, William Dodd, who you've met. And Roosevelt sort of scratched his head and remembered that he had met him during the campaign. And Dodd was a rather a simple man. He was from a small town in North Carolina, educated at Virginia Tech, and he had lived in Germany for a year. He'd studied there, so he spoke German quite well. He was he was the chairman of the history department at the University of Chicago. And so Roosevelt called him up and said, "I have a favor to ask of you." And Dodd, I think, probably thought somebody was playing a joke on him. But Roosevelt said, "I'd like you to become our ambassador to Germany. And, I want you to come and talk to me about it." And so Dodd does go to the White House and has this sort of very interesting lunch with Roosevelt. And Dodd is a little skeptical, but Roosevelt convinces him that he'll be a terrific ambassador. And I think because Dodd had no political experience, no diplomatic experience, Roosevelt said, "Listen, stay in touch with me. I want to see you when you come back to the United States. Write me letters. Tell me what's going on." And Dodd does that, and the letters become more and more concerning as the years pass by. The other thing that Roosevelt did when he was first elected, he gave Cordell Hull a sheet of paper, or a scrap of paper, really, and he'd scribbled 4 names on it. And these were people who were friends of his or who he admired. And 2 of them became ambassadors. One was a fellow named Breckinridge Long, whose ancestor was John Breckinridge, who'd been the vice president under a very undistinguished President James Buchanan. And Breckinridge Long was from Missouri. He'd run for the Senate twice there and not been successful, but he was nevertheless a very good fundraiser and a very good political operative. And he helped Roosevelt a lot in 1932. And incidentally, they had been had offices across the hall from one another in the Wilson administration. So that's when Roosevelt had gotten to know him, and Roosevelt liked him. Again, this was Long was sort of an aristocrat. He was considered Southern aristocracy. He was he'd gone to Princeton, and Roosevelt, he was Roosevelt's type of guy in some ways. And so, by the way, he was, his first letters, he didn't write to him and say, "Dear Mr. President," he wrote, "Dear Frank." He was the only ambassador who called him Frank, and over time that actually changed, and I think he reverted to Mr. President. So he was one person that Roosevelt trusted, and I think that, as we might talk about, that trust was somewhat misplaced in the end. The other one was William Bullitt, and again, Roosevelt had met him during the campaign, and Bullitt, they were immediately drawn to one another. Bullitt was an enormously charismatic, charming, intelligent man. He knew European history extremely well. He had actually been he'd also served in the Wilson administration, though Roosevelt hadn't really known him. And he'd actually negotiated with Lenin at the age of 28. He was just a multi-talented fellow. He'd written a novel between the wars that in the same year that The Great Gatsby was published, and it outsold The Great Gatsby. He was just a fascinating man, and Roosevelt liked him a lot. And so he became the first United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. And again, Roosevelt said, "Please just tell me we'd never had an ambassador. I want to know directly from you what you think of Stalin, how it's going. Will they pay reparations?" And Bullitt was only too happy to answer. He was an enormously gifted, but also enormously ambitious individual. The last ambassador who was featured in the book is Joseph Kennedy, who's well known to many of you. And Kennedy helped Roosevelt during the campaign, and was a very, very wealthy man. He made a sizable contribution. He was rewarded with the chairman of the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, where he did a terrific job. He only stayed there for about 1.5 years, but he did a wonderful job. He actually employed Tommy Corcoran, who wrote the Securities and Exchange Act. And afterwards, he wanted something. He'd always wanted to be Secretary of the Treasury, and he kept going back to Roosevelt and saying, "This is what I really want." And after the second term, Roosevelt made him chairman of the Maritime Commission, which was actually a demotion. But Kennedy, nevertheless, he accepted Roosevelt's offer, and again, he did quite a good job. And he continued to tell the president that what he really wanted was Secretary of the Treasury. Well, finally, Roosevelt, sort of in a backhanded way, offered him the Court of St. James. And it's an interesting story about how that developed. Kennedy, whether Roosevelt told him to write him or not, Kennedy was going to write him and was going to try to be in touch with him personally, because Kennedy was also very ambitious and very aggressive. So, I think he understood how important it was to get good information from the people on the ground. And in those days, this is before internet, this is before television, this is before social media. Having your ambassador write you and communicate with you directly was a pretty effective way to let you know what was happening.
How did that kind of direct access, though, affect Roosevelt's relationship with the State Department? And how did he think about the State Department? Clearly, he's appointing people with a very interesting background, but not necessarily all of them with diplomatic experience. And so you have some, I could see where there might be some friction there.
Sure. So let me start with how did he view the State Department? Because I think that's really the sort of the interesting question here. The State Department at the time was something like 700 diplomats who were all men. They were referred to as gentlemen. There were 2,500 support staff thereabouts, and they were mostly female. It was housed in the old executive office building with the Department of War, which I always think is sort of ironic. War is really the failure of diplomacy, and yet they were two offices away from one another. And Roosevelt referred to those in the State Department as the striped pants boys. And I think he thought that they were really a bunch of elite and effete dilettantes. Many of them he'd actually known in college or seen or met socially. They were from the same sort of social class. Mm-hmm. And Roosevelt, however, and you would know more about this than me, but I think he always had this belief that he was put on earth, he was made president because he was going to make his mark. And I think he thought people in the State Department were marking time. It was the big difference. So he had rather disdain for the State Department. But the other thing that interestingly, that Roosevelt had disdain for was sort of titles. He didn't. I mentioned that that he never really had a chief of staff, and that for a time Tommy Corcoran was sort of his most important domestic advisor, and Lewis Howe, who before Corcoran was really his right-hand man. He died, I think, in 1936. So that. Even in foreign policy, Roosevelt was, Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State, but Roosevelt had no reservations about circumventing Cordell Hull and going right to the ambassadors, and really in the later years about going to, in the late 1930s, going to the undersecretary, Sumner Welles, who mm-hmm. Roosevelt considered really a much more capable man than Cordell Hull. But Hull, he liked Hull, and Hull was had a lot of friends in the United States Senate, so he didn't fire him. He didn't ask him to step down. He just, when he wanted something that he thought was important that someone else could do better, he summoned that individual and asked them to do it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sure, did it cause friction in the State Department? I think it did cause friction in the State Department. It also gave, I think, unfortunately, license to some people to, like William Bullitt, to do some things that I think you would hope you wouldn't see in the State Department today. I mean, Bullitt actually did everything he could to get rid of Dodd. Yes, including writing the president and telling him directly, "You got to get rid of this guy." Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's one of the more interesting aspects of both Bullitt and Kennedy, was that they really, looking at their correspondence, they addressed the president. They might have said, "My dear Mr. President," in the salutation, but they addressed him as an equal and as people who felt they should be making policy. And here are my views, and this is what you should be doing.
Right. No, that's exactly right. And in Bullitt's case, again, I think Bullitt was. I've heard a couple of people say that I am a little hard on him in the book, and I actually think Bullitt was a brilliant guy and a pretty good ambassador, but he was so ambitious. He kept, particularly in the late 1930s or 1940, he kept telling Roosevelt that Roosevelt should telling him, not asking him, telling him that he should be put into the cabinet as either Secretary of the Navy or Secretary of War or even Secretary of State. He had a very, very high opinion of himself. But he gave, on the whole, he gave after sort of 1938, he gave Roosevelt very good advice. And I'm not sure that Roosevelt would have moved as quickly to rearm the United States had it not been for Bullitt sounding the alarm. Mm-hmm. In terms of Kennedy, that was just a fraught relationship from the beginning. They were never close friends. They were always competitors. And there was sort of a chess game going on between the two of them, I would say, and the pieces were stacked way in the favor of Roosevelt because, frankly, he's the president and so much more powerful, and actually so much more gifted at handling people.
Yes.
So that he would often, Kennedy would write and complain that what he thought wasn't being taken seriously, and that we ought to try to seek some sort of accommodation with Hitler, and that people running around saying that the United States should become more involved with Europe, that they had no business doing that. And Roosevelt would alternately, he would write back and say, listen, Joe, we need to talk about this. Please don't make these kinds of statements in public. And at other times, he'd write back and say, I just value your service so much, and you're doing such a wonderful job. And so Kennedy would sort of be assuaged, and he would stop talking to the press for a little bit of time, and giving Roosevelt heartburn, and then he'd start again, and Roosevelt would reprimand him. So it was a difficult relationship.
Yeah, totally. Toward the end of the book, that you said that Franklin Roosevelt wanted to hear different viewpoints, but in the end, he really wanted to have one advisor closer than anyone else. And when I read that, I started thinking about Louis Howe and what he had been to FDR. And it kind of made me think that maybe in a way he was always looking for somebody like that. He never really replaced Louis, but different people at different times. You mentioned Tommy Corcoran, and of course, Harry Hopkins. What was it about Harry Hopkins that you think, apart from his loyalty, because he was extremely loyal, that drew Roosevelt to him?
Yeah. So first of all, just on Louis Howe, that's exactly right. Roosevelt never did replace him, because Howe was not only a terrific sort of, he had great political antenna. He was really a family friend. I mean, I think, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I think he was actually very close to Eleanor as well.
Yes, they were extremely close.
Yeah, and the children all liked him, and he was part of the family. And Roosevelt made some political mistakes after Howe died. There's no doubt about it. And you're absolutely right. He was always looking for somebody to replace Louis Howe, who had that sort of, that touch, that political touch, but also understood, like Roosevelt in many ways. I think he had a good, good way of analyzing and understanding people. And there's an interesting part in the book, to me at least, that when Roosevelt's cruising, I think, in the Pacific, and this is when Mussolini is invading Ethiopia, and there are these cables from Breckinridge Long really kind of applauding this. And Roosevelt is outraged by it, but it's unclear what Roosevelt's going to do. And Howe says to him, boss, you got to get rid of this guy. He's bad news. I know he's your friend, but you've got to get rid of him. He's he's supporting a guy here who is going to cause a lot of trouble for the United States down the road. So Louis Howe was an extraordinary man. You know, likewise, Harry Hopkins is this sort of very unconventional, interesting guy. I mean, he's from Iowa originally. He's not Ivy League educated. He went to Cornell College. He'd worked for Roosevelt in New York State when Franklin Roosevelt was the governor, but Franklin Roosevelt didn't know him terribly well then. And he took over, obviously the Works Projects Administration during the New Deal, eventually became Secretary of Commerce. And then at the end, I say he was in some ways our first national security advisor, because he's the one who Roosevelt really relied on to negotiate with Stalin and to go visit with Winston Churchill. And I pulled a quote about him that I just want to read. I didn't try not to include a lot of long quotes in the book, but I just think this one is just so revealing, and frankly, I couldn't have written it, so I wanted to put it in there. And this is from Robert Sherwood, who was, President Roosevelt's speechwriter. And he writes about Hopkins. Hopkins naturally and easily conformed to the essential Benjamin Franklin tradition of American diplomacy, acting on the conviction that when an American representative approaches his opposite numbers in friendly countries with the standard striped pants frigidity, the strict observance of protocol and amenities, and a studied air of lip curling, he is not actually representing America, not at any rate the America of which FDR was president. And that's just that is just a wonderful sort of summary of Harry Hopkins. He gets off the plane in London. He's wearing this rumpled suit, and Churchill's men are there to greet him, and they're wearing bowler hats and striped pants, and they're a little horrified by this guy. But much to Churchill's credit, Churchill immediately warms to him because Hopkins is so bright and so engaging, and has got such a good heart, frankly.
I think as you were talking about Hopkins, I was thinking about Benjamin Franklin, and when he goes to Paris in the 1780s to negotiate the loans from at the French court, and how he shows up in kind of a coonskin cap. Right. And all the French ladies fall in love with him and start calling him Cher Papa Franklin. It's that American naturalness. And actually, Eleanor Roosevelt has it too. I mean, in the sense that after Franklin, when she really starts traveling internationally, particularly after she goes to the UN, she becomes the embodiment of America. To be an American, if you wanted to know what an American looked like, you looked at her, because she embodied that same kind of down to earth. I'm here. I want to know about you. Can we get together and have a chat? Just a very warm, down to earth person. And I think Harry Hopkins was probably the same way.
Yeah. Well, just on the subject of Eleanor, I mean, I know you have written about her, and I do want to just sort of tell this one story, which I just love, because Breckinridge Long, after he was ambassador to Italy, he came back. And he was made the Assistant Secretary of State, and I think it was for administration. I don't even think it's a position that exists now for administration, but he was essentially running the State Department. He was managing it, and part of his portfolio was immigration. And Long was a terrible anti-Semite. I mean, he just was. It was. I say in the book, it's really one of Roosevelt's greatest failings. I think that he made him Assistant Secretary and then sort of ignored him. He didn't greenlight a lot of what Long was doing, but neither did he stop him. And Long was really doing everything he could to keep European Jews out of the United States. And there's a story that appears, and I can't remember if it's Drew Pearson. I think it's Drew Pearson that writes about it in the Washington, it's not the Washington Post at the time, but one of the major Washington Star.
I think it's the Times Herald. That's what it was.
That's what it is, Times Herald, exactly. Yeah. Thank you. And it basically explains that this is what Breckinridge Long is doing, that he's keeping, he's keeping the walls up and not letting people in at this sort of dire time in Europe. And so that, Eleanor and Franklin are having breakfast that morning, and Eleanor's reading this, and so is Franklin, by the way. She tells him to look at the story. And then she sort of, puts her head up from the paper and she says, Franklin, he's a fascist. and you can just sort of see it, because Franklin Roosevelt, he had this common touch, but again, he was also this, very much this kind of upper class wasp in a lot of ways. And he sort of looks at Eleanor and says, "Oh, Eleanor, you mustn't say that." And she says, "I'm saying it because it's true." And, it didn't necessarily change Roosevelt's mind, although he did help out on a couple of discrete situations. But it was, I think, a great example of sort of their relationship. She was the political conscience in many, many ways.
She once described herself as the agitator and he was the politician.
That's great. I love it.
Because she would say provocative things like that.
Yeah.
In order to get them talked about, in hopes that it would generate public opinion and that would help move the needle.
Sure.
And I'm glad that you mentioned Breckinridge Long, because I wanted to ask you if you thought that there was a link between kind of the anti-Semitism and the isolationism that was going on in the country that was very prevalent. And here FDR put somebody in a key spot in the State Department who can, he's obviously doing something. He's not overriding public opinion. It's like he's doing that to assuage those people. He's leaving Breckinridge Long there. And then there are other things that he's doing. And I just wondered what you thought about the role of public opinion and how it affected Roosevelt's appointments.
So, again, Roosevelt, because he was I think a master politician, was always very cognizant of what public opinion was at the time. And Roosevelt was not a perfect man by any means. Whether it's the internment of the Japanese or his sort of ignoring Black Americans at the time, and allowing this sort of anti-Semitism from members of his administration. He was flawed, but at the same time, I think, and I said this to you, off camera here, that I think he was somebody who, as a politician, was always juggling sort of 4 or 5 things at one time. Mm-hmm. And these were big things that he was juggling. I mean, he was juggling, and as I began, an economy that was in ruins. And by the late 1930s and early 40s, before the Second World War, an impending implosion in Europe. And so, there's this quote that he makes after he tries to get the United States more involved in international affairs by what he wants to do is have a sign on to the World Court. And he gets just, lambasted by many of his friends in the Senate, who are, again, reflective of the American sort of sentiment at the time, which is, we don't want anything to do with anyone outside of the United States. We're not going to get involved. We don't want to be part of the Treaty of Versailles. We don't want to be part of the World Court. And he loses badly. And he says to one of his aides, he says, it's a terrible thing to try to lead and to look over your shoulder and find there's no one following you.
Right.
And so, I think he understood that it was very important for him to maintain a sense of momentum, and he didn't want to look as though he was getting beaten by the Senate at every point, because although he was very successful early on with the Congress, that changed over time. And so he had many difficult issues to cope with. Right. Reminds me of a president today, by the way.
Yeah, when you really sit back and think about it, he he was president, and he was president for a long time. I mean, 12 years. That's a long time to be dealing with really catastrophic problems.
Yeah. Just to interrupt quickly. I mean, he says in 1935, he says, he said, I actually think, and he says this publicly, and it gets a fair amount of publicity. He says, I actually think that Europe's problems are actually more concerning now than our domestic problems. But again, that's not a popular statement. And so at the same time, he signs a neutrality bill in 1935, and then he signs another neutrality bill in 1936. And then in 1939, he says to Frank Murphy, his attorney general, he said, is there any way to circumvent this damn neutrality bill? He said, I know I signed it, but can we circumvent it? And so, he's always sort of thinking about how he can fix things and perhaps do a couple of things simultaneously, and it's not easy.
Right. And I think that is kind of part of his genius too, is that he could wear different faces for different constituencies. And, I'm going to do this for you, but then on the other hand, he could turn around and do something else for the people who are completely polar opposite. And he's always running on parallel tracks.
Yes.
And it's kind of interesting just to watch him kind of maneuvering through all of that. You've been an ambassador yourself, and now you've written about these ambassadors. How do you conceive now of the job of ambassador, and perhaps how has it changed since these men were in those roles?
Sure. So look, first of all, ambassadors. Yeah, I've actually worked in. I think I've had an interesting career. I was the staff director of Foreign Relations Committee for a time, and that's really an oversight role. And then in the State Department as policy planning, we conceived policy. I don't think we made policy, but we conceived it. And then, as an ambassador, it's a different role. It's not oversight. It's not conceiving policy. It's really communicating it and implementing it. And those are important components of a diplomatic mission. And I think it's more important than ever now, because we're obviously a much more globalized world. News travels very, very fast, and ambassadors have an increasingly important role. And obviously, it depends on the country. I remember John Kerry telling me that a couple of our ambassadors were literally holding the countries together because they're so important as advisors and in implementation of not only our agenda, but of hopefully, if it's an agenda we would agree with, of a host country agenda as well. And so ambassadors are important. And sadly, today we find we've had very few ambassadors confirmed. It's gotten so politicized. Many of them are being held up. I mean, we have one of our greatest diplomats, Nick Burns, is now being held up for God knows what reason, and we need him in China. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know someone like that whose nomination's also been held up. It's very bad.
It is bad.
And you mentioned, the relationship the ambassador has with the host country. And I was very struck by, Dodd in Germany takes a very hands-off kind of attitude. He's not going to invite the Nazis to his residence. He's not going to any events. He really tries to make his disapproval known. Whereas in Great Britain, Joe Kennedy, he becomes very close with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and really kind of an apologist for the kind of the appeasement policy that Chamberlain is promoting. How does an ambassador kind of walk that line?
Well, that's a really good question. And, it obviously depends on each situation. I'm not sure either Dodd or Kennedy walked that line terribly well, to be honest. And by the way, getting back to sort of how ambassadors are, whether it's changed or not. I mean, Dodd was actually, I don't think he even had a hearing. He was confirmed on a voice vote. So that I do think at least people pay more attention to who's going to become an ambassador now than they did in those days. It was, it was not something that was necessarily focused on that clearly. In terms of Dodd, however, he arrived in Germany, and I think he tried to have an open mind initially about the government and even about Hitler, who he understood was Hitler was the chancellor then, but he was not in full control of the government. And over time, and particularly after the Night of the Long Knives, which was the purge of the Nazi Party, when Hitler and his thugs killed scores of other Nazi soldiers and sympathizers in order to have absolute power. And they, by the way, rounded up a lot of innocent people and killed them too. After that, Dodd recognized that this was going to be a very, very tough road for him to go down. And he had a couple of meetings with Hitler that, particularly the second one, that did not go well, where Hitler ranted at him and talked in a very derogatory manner about German Jews and American Jews. And I think Dodd recognized that at a certain point that he was powerless to do anything. So he decided to really step back, and it was a difficult. He was in an incredibly difficult position. I'm not exactly sure what he could have done. I think probably it would have, in that situation, he clearly needed more direction from both Hull and from Roosevelt, which he didn't get. Mm-hmm. But I would have hoped he would have actually spoken out more there and perhaps been sent home. Instead, he sort of treaded water for a year and a half, and then came home. In terms of Kennedy, it's unclear to me what Roosevelt told him when Kennedy was sent off to the United Kingdom. Roosevelt could have very well said, I expect you to take the bull by the horns, and we'll look forward to your reports. But I doubt he said that. And Kennedy did, as you suggest. He became very close to Neville Chamberlain and really adopted appeasement as a United States policy, which he was not empowered to do. And for that, he was, in the end, was brought back to the United States. Roosevelt was careful not to alienate him because he needed him for the election in 1940. Right. And so that he actually got Kennedy to endorse him and to give a speech on national radio, not public radio, on all three networks, endorsing him, which again was another sort of political genius move by Roosevelt.
Yes, that's for sure. One of the things that really struck me as I read the book was how often it resonated. There were parts of the book that really resonated with kind of the general climate that we're in today. I was thinking especially of Ambassador Bullitt, and I'm reading here, who said, "All democracies find it hard to face unpleasant facts and prefer to cling to happy illusions until they are hit in the head, as we were at Pearl Harbor. But if democracies do not act in time, they are obliged finally to resort to the most costly form of defense." And even the title of the book, Watching Nightfall, I thought was very evocative of, it made me think, okay, here in the 1930s, there's a lot of hand-wringing going on and a lot of, well, what should we do? And here we are in 2021, there's a lot of hand-wringing and what should we do going on. The issues are different, right? They weren't worried about global warming, or the rise of China, or some of the other things that we're dealing with. But how would you relate the America of the 1930s to America 2021 and America's
Sure.
role in the world?
Sure. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about the title. It's a title I actually came up with. I originally thought about just calling it Darkness Falls, but then I as you have to, I Googled to see if there are any other books called Darkness Falls. There were no other books called Darkness Falls, but there was a TV show, and it's about a vengeful spirit that has taken the form of the Tooth Fairy. So I decided that I had to somehow to tweak the title a little bit. So it was Watching Darkness Falls is what I wound up with. And it's not to connote necessarily, a passivity on the part of our ambassadors, because I think this did unfold over time. And again, Dodd, for his foibles, saw this very early on. In 1935, he wrote Roosevelt, and he said, if we don't assert American, I'm paraphrasing, if we don't sort of assert American leadership in a more forceful way, I see nothing to stop Italy, Germany, and Japan from asserting themselves, essentially. And even William Bullitt, he was a little bit late in terms of his recognition of how serious this was. But after the Munich Agreement, he really did convince Roosevelt that it was time to begin to build up an American Air Force. And he told him, he said, if you begin to assemble 1 million-man army today, in a year or two, you're going to be thankful that you have it. So he knew what was coming. They were prescient. And again, Roosevelt had so many different, difficult things that he was dealing with at the time. But eventually, he also was looking for ways to provide lend-lease to the British and to the Soviets. So again, I just want to sort of emphasize, I don't think they were completely supine in the face of this. As to sort of the similarities between the 1930s and today, sure, there are a lot of similarities. There really are. I mean, that sort of isolationist mode that they were in the 1930s, I think it permeates our country today. And globally, just as you saw the rise of fascism, then you're seeing the rise of sort of these illiberal states, or the rise of and the rise of states that actually were democratic at one time and are now pulling back, whether it's Philippines and Hungary and Turkey, obviously a member of NATO. So there are similarities. I don't want to sort of overdraw them, though. However, I think that's a little dangerous. I do worry, as I hope increasingly more people worry about our own democratic institutions, which were severely tested, a year ago, and I think are going to be severely tested in the future. But there is not a sort of, a crazy madman on the horizon whose goal is to conquer the world, and Hitler really was that. Yeah, sure. There are similarities, and we've got to. I think the other thing that's incredibly important. It's one of the things that Bart and I wrote about in the other book, and in Partners of First Resort. If you don't have American leadership globally, a lot of bad things happen. Is probably the best way to put it. And so that we need to make sure that we are taking care of our allies, and that we are leading the rest of the world, both morally and politically.
I just wanted to invite people, if you do want to send us a question, you can do that by email at gep@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet us at Wilson Center GEP. In terms of thinking about Roosevelt as a leader, what do you think were really his most salient characteristics? What made him an effective leader?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think he was someone who, when he made a decision, he was not somebody that backed down from it. And so, there were times when he could be very, very political, but there were other times when he was enormously courageous. And when he decided again to push Lend-Lease through, not popular at the time, but he knew it was the right thing. And it was, it took courage to do it. And I think he was, I think he showed real leadership. And he also he had that ability to, I think, to bring out the best in people. He, again, could be extremely political and flattering, but he also knew how to encourage people to, to perform at a high level. And so that, and he was open. The other thing that a lot of leaders, I think, fail to do is to listen. And Franklin Roosevelt, I mean, it's one of the reasons he wanted to hear from his ambassadors. And there's a interesting story about when Frances Perkins goes and she visits Bullitt in France, and she gets the sense that the French are not prepared to fight, and that they are dissatisfied with their own government. That frankly, there's just not the political will there to do very much. And she comes back and she tells Roosevelt this, and Roosevelt, he says, "Well, that's not what Bill Bullitt's telling me." And she said, "Well, this is what I'm telling you." And I was only there for a few weeks, but I talked to all kinds of people. And Roosevelt sort of files it away, and he clearly takes it on board. And that's the kind of thing that I think, it's just one small example of the kind of information that he was able to sift through and ultimately to reach, I think, important conclusions.
Along that same line, one of the things you mentioned in the book, you compare FDR and Hopkins, and you say that both of them relied on their instincts and what they knew about human nature. And I wanted to ask you about that. Those are very ephemeral things. And what role does that play in effective leadership?
Well, I think it's, again, it's huge. It's a little bit hard to talk about it sort of as an abstract concept. But again, these were both men who were sort of down, they could be, I mean, again, while Roosevelt was this sort of upper class WASP, he could be very down to earth. And obviously, Harry Hopkins loved, sort of the pomp and circumstance too. He said one of his greatest thrills in England was meeting the king and the queen. But they also cared about the average person, and they cared a lot about the average person, and they had empathy, and I think it made them, not just better people. I think it made them better leaders.
Maybe they too, having those kinds of skills, they might have been able to size up people.
Definitely, and
a little more quickly.
Yeah, you see that too with Hopkins when he visits Churchill, and Roosevelt had never really gotten along. It's an interesting sort of relationship that others have written about this, the relationship between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. They'd never really gotten along with one another. Churchill didn't remember meeting Roosevelt in 1919, but Roosevelt remembered meeting Churchill, and he didn't like him. He thought Churchill was heavy-handed and sort of this sort of English superiority, and Roosevelt actually didn't like the English that much, to be honest. But Hopkins, developed this rapport with Churchill and sort of saw him. And Roosevelt and Churchill had not met each other since that time. But when Hopkins went to London and met with Churchill, and they developed this rapport, and Churchill says, I need to meet with the president because we've got to talk about some of these serious matters. And Hopkins makes that happen. And that's because he understands that these two men can actually will actually find sort of common ground with each other, that in many ways they're searching for the same thing. And so they get together. This is the famous meeting off the coast of Newfoundland, where the Atlantic Charter is ultimately settled on. And Hopkins is the one that sort of makes it happen and negotiates it.
Yeah, he really is kind of the pivotal figure in many ways, because he's and eventually he goes and negotiates with Stalin as well. And so he's like Roosevelt's legs in a way. He's doing
absolutely. That's a good way to put it.
Roosevelt would have done if he could have been mobile.
It's a good way to put it. Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely.
And how frustrating it must have been for him to sit in the Oval Office every day.
Yeah.
And have to rely on all this information coming in. And it's always made me wonder if maybe that wasn't why he was always sending somebody out.
Oh, I don't think there's a doubt, not a doubt about it. And obviously when he eventually, after the war starts and the trips he makes to Casablanca and Tehran, and those are terribly wearing on Roosevelt, debilitating to him. So that this was a brave man who was coping with obviously with his disability but felt it was critical to attend these meetings.
I always tell people that it wasn't luxurious travel during World War II.
Right.
The planes weren't pressurized, no hot meals. They're sitting on parachutes. And he probably had to be strapped in,
right.
so that he, in a very rigid way that wouldn't be necessary for a person who was mobile.
Right.
So yeah, you're exactly right. And when you think about particularly when he goes to Yalta in 1945, he's a dying man.
Yes.
And what an effort that must have been.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming up to about 3:00, the end of our time together. And I think we probably have time for maybe one quick question. One of our viewers has asked, how did the ambassador's cables affect the thinking of the FDR administration, kind of broadly?
Sure. So again, they were important to both to FDR and to Cordell Hull. So Hull was not completely invisible during this period, and many of the cables, came directly to him. I'm thinking of George Messerschmitt in Austria, who wrote cables to Hull. Didn't have that relationship with Roosevelt that the other ambassadors did. And again, because they had their ear to the ground in these various countries, the cables were enormously important. And Roosevelt, not only did he read these personal letters and have meetings, he would actually read some of the cables that came in to the secretary as well from countries like Italy and Germany. So very, very important part of the whole information puzzle.
Just one last thought. As you were talking about what Roosevelt was doing, on the advice of Bill Bullitt and other people in the late 1930s, it struck me that a lot of what he was doing, he didn't feel he was limited what he could do internationally. So he really kind of concentrates his efforts on what he can do to build up the United States militarily. Again, taking a very domestic approach to an international problem. And I thought that you did, you really brought that out and made it much more central to what he did.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think he, again, I think he believed that, and he sort of, that's how he frames Lend-Lease, to be honest. He says, look, Lend-Lease is our best form of defense. Right. Because, we're going to be giving things to our friends, but they're going to be paying us back, and it's going to make us stronger. It's going to increase our defenses, as well as helping our friends. And so, yeah, I think that was always, Roosevelt was a genius at always putting the American people first, and I think that's why he was elected 4 times.
Yes, yes. And I think people followed him on that basis,
Yeah.
because they felt that he had their interests at heart.
Yeah.
And that was that. There's a wonderful story about Eleanor. After he dies, of course, she goes back and lives in New York, and she's in and out of the city. And I personally often thought she knew every cab driver in Manhattan. And after FDR died, she was in a cab, and the cab driver turns to her and says, "Now who will explain my government to me?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've always thought that epitomized the Roosevelts, both of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great story. Wish I'd known that. I would have put it in the book.
Oh, I'm sorry. We should have talked. It's 3:00, and so we must say goodbye. But I'd like to thank Ambassador McKean and also the Wilson Center for having us this afternoon, and to thank all of you in our audience who tuned in, and to invite you to continue to support the Wilson Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it.